Okay, welcome everyone to the January talk for Vermont Historical Society. We are super excited today to have Mariessa Dobrick from the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration with us. And we look forward to a wonderful and intriguing talk from her. Just a quick note before we move forward, we do have another of our virtual talks in February, which features David Smith, who will be talking about Admiral George Dewey. So if you haven't registered for that, feel free to go to our website, vermonthistory.org, to look for all the great events and programs we have going on throughout the year. And so we'll jump right into it, but I'm very excited today to have Mariessa here with us. She's a wonderful colleague of ours, and she has been an archivist at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration since 2011. She is a transplant to Vermont who earned her BA in French from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and holds her MA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Information School. She is certified by the Academy of Certified Archivists. She is an avid history enthusiast and lives in Barre with her husband, Will, and son, Roger. And with that, I will turn it over to her.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Welcome to True Crime Vermont, Intrigue in the Archives. Today, we're going to discuss a presentation about a murder that took place in the small town of Andover in November of 1914, and also give you some ideas for how to do your own historic true crime research. We'll begin. This is our agenda. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to where I work so you can get an idea of how I do my research. A very introduction to that murder that happened in the small hamlet of Simonsville in Andover, and then how to use surviving records to research your own historic crime research, how you can contact us, and then the brief Q&A if there's time. This is just a slide to show you what the Vermont State Archives looks like. We are located at 1078 US Route 2 in Middlesex, and our hours for the reference room are Monday through Friday, and that's 9 to 4. Unfortunately, we don't have weekend hours, but we are happy to respond to requests, and I will have my contact information on the last slide. We have many, many public records from the history of the Republic of Vermont and pre and colonial times going to the present, really the last legislative session last year. Some are digital, most are not. And we have a lot of containers of untapped historic items. So we welcome you to come and contact us and find out more. I get a lot of people who tell me that government records sound boring, and I'm sure that it can sound that way. But I just wanted to give you a sample of the other kinds of government criminal records we have that are not just the story I'm getting ready to tell you. We have the investigative shooting into the murder of May LaBelle, and we have her dying statement. It's a very, very heart-wrenching story because she knew she was dying and accused the person who killed her. We have the admission ticket to the execution of Edwin Hayden in our records. And we also have the individual files of some of the people who were criminals and people who were executed by the state of Vermont. Vermont's executions weren't as extensive as other places. There's about 54 in its history, but they're a fascinating look at Vermont and throughout time. I wanted to give you a word about the Andover tragedy. Essentially, it's sort of a content warning. I simply can't hide the fact that this was a murder. I can't hide the fact that there were two people who were murdered brutally. And I also don't want to hype it without being aware that these were real people, even if it's over 100 years ago now. So we're going to begin with the Andover tragedy and a brief introduction to the people. I have to say, although I did try to be neutral, I felt like as I've sort of known these folks for a while, that they are people that I kind of feel protective of, especially the victims. I found the story initially, and so it was part of an article in 2018 that I wrote for the Burlington Free Press. Since I wrote the article, it's been a few years now, I've actually learned quite a bit more. We've had additional records that have come in about this case. So there's a lot more to it as records are uncovered or we receive them in the state archives. These are our victims today. So kind of setting the scene, Andover, Vermont had about 250 people. That's it in 1914, and it's still a very small town. It's a very close-knit part of the southern part of Windsor County in the state. And these are some of the farmers and blacksmiths and postmistresses. That was the term for the postmaster of the post office. And these are people who lived, worked, and died in Andover and Vermont. The first victim was Georgia. She's also called Georgiana, and I'm not quite sure what her full name was legally, but George Wiggins was 61 years old. She was the second wife of Henry Wiggins. She was the mother of 4, stepmother of 6, and she raised many of her stepchildren, and by all accounts was a pillar of the community of Andover with her husband, Henry Fillmore Wiggins, who went by H.F. Wiggins quite often, was a wealthy farmer. He'd been a representative of Andover, and he was also the father of Etta Warner, who we'll meet in a moment. He was the father of 10 adult children at this time, and he was one of the victims. Etta Wiggins Warner, later Huntoon, is about 34. She was the postmistress of the Simonsville post office, and she, because of her family's connections, she owned the family home and blacksmith shop. The post office was actually connected to her home. She'd been the postmistress for a few years after passing a very rigorous exam, and she married George Warner in 1897 when she was 18. In 1914, she had 5 living children with George Warner, and she had just started divorce proceedings against him at the urging of her parents because there were domestic abuse. She was being harmed in several ways, probably verbally, as well as emotionally and physically. And her parents, stepmother and stepfather, both encouraged her to divorce George Warner. And that's where this sort of begins. The perpetrator and the witnesses. George Warner was about 46 when this merger occurs. He was the son of Calvin Warner, who had died, and Hattie Graves. His parents had divorced in 1872, and he was their only child. Etta Warner was his second wife, and his wife, he'd first married Grace Spooley, and she died in 1895 along with their child, and Grace was only 16. So there was pneumonia and other epidemics going on in Vermont at the time. He left the home and had been kicked out because Hattie was willing to take him in, and he was living with his mother Hattie and his half-brother Jay. George is the only suspect of the murder, and we're going to get a feel for what's going on momentarily. I just wanted you to know these major players in this story. Hattie was 66 years old. She was the mother and doting mother to George. She had divorced her first husband and married Frank Graves. She was actually divorced at this point. She had other children, some daughters and sons, but only her youngest stayed and helped her on the farm. Jay Graves was 25, and he was the half-brother to George. So this is just a word about Simonsville in 1914. There aren't a lot of maps that I could find, so I actually had to turn to the National Archives. And these are some photos just to give you a feel for what the town was like at the time. You can see Simonsville was very small, and it had kind of a close-knit feel for itself. It was divided by Terrible Mountain, which is a great name for a place that might have some true crime happening. Originally, the town that became Weston was part of Andover, but because the mountain made it hard to do business, they ended up becoming 2 separate, smaller towns. It was actually very centrally located at this time before there was highways. The stagecoach and rural mail service went through. There was only one major building in the Simonsville area, which was the Simonsville, later called the Inn. And so it was the Ramsdale Inn. And the census was at most 300 people in 1910. So it's on Route 11. There's Londonderry, there's Chester, there's Weston, and there's Andover. So all of these had enough cross traffic discussion and knowledge of each other, but it's still a very small, close-knit area. November 5th, 1914 was a pretty difficult day in this community. It had kind of, from what I can tell, been pretty much the kinds of things you can see in the society papers. The Wiggins were incredibly popular people. They worked since 1878, and it was 1914. They'd retired for the most part and still ran the farm. They had all grown-up children and were living just the two of them together with many visits by their family members. And Ramsdale Amsden lived down the road. There was a party line, if anybody remembers those kinds of lines. So there was a phone call that was on a party line, and everybody should have been home at that time. And so somebody who was on that same line was their son-in-law, Ramsdale Amsden, and nobody was answering. So he became very alarmed. And at that point, he left his own home in the evening and went to the family farm. And he was even more upset because he found bullets and he found broken glass. From what I can tell, it doesn't seem like he really stayed around to see what was going on. He went and got help, grew about most of the neighbors of the area, which were farms that were kind of far apart from each other. But they gathered a group to start looking, and it didn't take them very long to find, there was a woodshed that was just off of the home, and they found Georgina, Mrs. Wiggins, shot in the head and covered with carpet. They followed a blood trail a couple of hours later from a carriage to a barn where they found Mr. Henry Wiggins under straw, and he'd been also shot. And this was I don't think there's any other mentions of murder in this town at this point. So they were all extremely alarmed. And at this point, the sole subject that they could have thought who'd have done it was George Warner, the son-in-law, because they knew that Etta, Mrs. Warner, had started divorce proceedings and that George Warner had been known for a long time to dislike his father-in-law. There was basically a manhunt, though, because he was gone for 24 hours and there was a lot of alarm. And people from the small town didn't have a lot of interactions. They had sheriffs, they had other kinds of people, but there was no state police at this time. There was no other major investigation services. So we have these local small town folks calling on the limited lines to get Burlington and to get help from the state coroner, to get help from other investigators. And it required coming down train and other ways of getting to them. And so people were up very late at night, while also locals were starting to look for George Warner to find out if they could find him. Some people at this time who had seen him earlier thought that maybe George Warner had committed suicide, but at this point they did not know. This is just a look at sort of that area. You can see the inn, the blacksmith shop was across from that. So they were this wasn't that far from each other. A couple of miles is where all of this was happening. And so there was a very intense manhunt going on. And after about 24 hours full exposure outside, they found George Warner. He was actually just on his mother's property, and it was his much younger brother, Jay Graves, who convinced him to turn himself in. So he surprisingly was allowed to go to this inn, the center of sort of this hamlet's activities, and he was allowed to get a meal. He was allowed to go to his mother's and get a change of clothes before they took him to the Chester lockup. There was no other holding facility that they could take him at this point before holding him for an initial appearance. So they took him to Chester, where there was a depot. While there, on the 6th of November, so a couple of days after the murder, he gave a full statement explaining exactly what he had done. He explained that he had gone to see his wife at the post office, their former home together, and that he had threatened her, he had beaten her, and she'd been alarmed. He'd gone off, he'd gone to the home of his in-laws, the Wiggins, down a road, and he actually shot at Hetty, at Georgina Wiggins first when she was just sitting in her rocking chair. And she got up and tried to escape, and he chased her right into the woodshed and shot her and covered her up. And then he waited several hours until Mr. Henry Wiggins returned. So Henry had gone to help his daughter because Etta had called in distress about having been hurt by her estranged husband. And so George waited, and once George had seen Henry coming, he didn't even really give him a minute. He just shot him directly in the chest. So this confession is was happened just 2 days later, and it was signed, and we have it. So it was pretty clear that George had done the murder. But how are you doing for the rest of this? How do you track these different pieces? And a lot of what I track is actually by the newspapers. Newspapers are available widely for Vermonters with access to newspapers.com with a free account. And I'll have steps later on in the presentation on how you can access those yourself. But finding all these pieces and learning all these names kind of feels like you're looking at an entire story, a true crime story playing out, but these are real people, and I've sort of kind of felt like I knew them. So right after all of this happened, he was immediately held over in the jail. And this was the old Windsor County Jail. It was torn down in the 1930s for the new jail, which is probably no longer in use. This kind of holding was brief. It was just to hold him until the Christmas holidays and other holidays were over and they could do an initial appearance at the county court. He was held without bail by a municipal judge. And the very first thing that he did upon that was say that he was insane. So he was charged in the Windsor County Court, and this photo was done by somebody named John Deacon. I encourage you to check out his courthouse research. He visits courthouses all over the country and takes photos of them, looking at their style. So a lot of these old courthouses still have that feel of how they're meant to be overwhelming. And I think a blacksmith like George Warner might have felt that. Insanity at this time meant that he was going to be held for observation, which was only supposed to be a few weeks. He was held under observation at what is now the Vermont State Hospital building. These days, we call these the psychiatric hospitals. Back then, it was the State Hospital for the Insane at Waterbury. Observation and records like this are closed for researchers unless the person's been deceased over 50 years. And you'll see here, there's not a lot of information about it other than his name, the residence, why he's being held, that it was an observation court case. And then it gives sort of the patient counts and censuses as well as his age. The thing about this age is his age and the ages of many of these people is not really clear to me. He's listed as 47, but I think he was younger if I'm looking at other records we have. Surprising, we have a lot of state hospital records that are related to the administration. And this is actually a postcard that was given out. And people use these as sort of tourists. They could come to the insane asylum and visit it on visiting day. And these records are available for researchers who might be interested in the state hospital and how the treatment of mentally ill patients worked at that time. George was supposed to have been held for just observation for a brief time, but unfortunately there was a significant delay because the administration, the Attorney General was going to get started in the legislative session, and the legislative session was starting his full attention. One of the things you'll notice again and again with a lot of these stories is that the court delays have all sorts of reasons, but what surprises me is this is the very first use for a capital murder. Since George Warner was being tried for first-degree murder of these two people, they were being very careful in what they were doing because execution up until now had been by hanging in the yard at Windsor Prison. And they had just changed it to the electric chair. And this was going to be the very first use of the electric chair if George Warner was found guilty. So they were being extremely cautious and careful as they went along to make sure that every step was taken to be clear. And so I think that might be why we have as extensive material that we do. So this is just items that help document the trial delay. We have court dockets, and I'm going to talk more about researching court dockets and how you can use them for tracing cases. But I continued to use the newspapers as well. And he was held basically just in an observational ward. There was no real concern for treatment at this point for him because it was just observation. He was also, when it came to this, there were, they called them criminally insane, and that was what they were there for. And so it's pretty easy to track people who were there for criminal insanity. These days, I think there's a lot more concern about treatment and concern for privacy, but that was not at all the case in 1914. We have clear things in the newspaper that are personal and private information, including possible medical diagnoses. And that also has been good for somebody doing a true crime because you find all these stories. The trial finally began in June of 1915, and it went through July. It is documented in a 765-page transcript of the trial, and that has rebuttals, the various witnesses for both the defense and the offense. It has, the plaintiffs, the state as the plaintiffs. It is pretty clear, though, that there was a lot of breathless documentation explaining each step of it. Sometimes there's also some personal notes, like something said, well, Jay Graves spoke today, that's the half-brother of the perpetrator, and what he said was of no real importance. So those kinds of things are still, I think, part of TikTok and other kinds of media things today is where people say them, but they said them fully. You can also see, if you follow these cases in the newspaper, that some papers are weekly. Some of the smaller ones don't have anything until a month later. So he's already been found and tried by the time somebody in the upper and northern reaches of the state might have found this information. And then it also kind of goes down the line. So some people just wholeheartedly pinch from each other. So I tried to get examples of the various headlines and cases from all over. But this initial trial, they had several people observing. They had a lot of the accounts of sort of the horrific last moments. They had scientific things, the coroners, the sheriffs, the various deputies, the various neighbors who came and helped find remains. And I think the hardest thing to read and remind yourself in these cases is that these people were seeing their neighbors, their friends, sometimes their relatives, because they were all playing these parts. So sometimes the sexton who was doing the burials was also the person who had to do the initial investigation of the bodies until the coroner from the Burlington could come. So it felt, as I see these, that these are people. These are people who are living this, and they all knew George Warner. They all knew the Wiggins. They knew their children. They knew each other. And so even though we're looking at these from afar in newspapers and transcripts, I felt like I was catching pieces of these a little bit at a time. So this trial went on for most in people's minds for a long time. But even though the state argued that there was a hereditary syphilis, and the general practitioner of George Warner tried to argue that he'd gone insane, that he was just increasingly more agitated as time went on. The case, because of his confession, was pretty much where they decided. So they found him guilty. He'd only been tried truly for mostly Henry Wiggins' murder, but that was enough. And he was immediately transferred by governor's orders from the Windsor County Jail to the Windsor State Prison. And you can see this is just part of that facility as it looked in the 1920s. He wasn't given his full sentence immediately because he was brought in for the Supreme Court first. And I'm not sure why. The Supreme Court by this point, historically, it had gone circuit. It used to go from different parts of the state because it was harder for people to get from one end to the other before there were trains. But now that there were trains, they started mostly meeting in Montpelier at the Supreme Court building. But perhaps because of what was going on with this as a major capital case, this was actually held at the Brooks House in Brattleboro. And he was brought in from the court by the deputy and sheriff, and then he was returned to the prison the very next day. They deliberated, and it wasn't until May where they made their final decision. He was fully sentenced to death, but he had a full 2 years essentially to wait. And I'm really not sure if that was why that was, but it's a very telling thing. It said judgment that there was no error in the proceedings, that the defendant takes nothing by the exceptions. Those are what he offered as why he shouldn't be executed, and sentence imposed, and it should be done. So those kinds of things hit me too, because it says that during the week of Monday next, after the first day of July 1919, within the walls or enclosed yard of said prison, you be put to death by electrocution according to statutes in such cases made and provided, and that you may stand committed until sentence is compiled with, and may God have mercy on your soul. That execution did in fact happen July 12, 1919. There were some last minute attempts to try to save him, and all of them failed. So the documents that we have in our holdings include the death warrant. And this death warrant actually has a typo, which as somebody who works in archives, I was a little astonished that a typo document on such a grave matter could show up. We have the death warrants for pretty much most of the cases that started in the 1800s into the 1950s. And you'll see also the death record for George Warner, and that it said that the disease causing death was legal electrocution. The way that this actually occurred was he was taken from about, I think, a month before the case and the legal execution. He was taken to a death house that was right next to the death chamber where the electric chair was set up. And he was allowed to see his mother, his sisters. His oldest son wanted to see him, and he was allowed to see his oldest son. And then he was also allowed to say goodbye. About a week before the execution, he became a Christian. He was baptized as a Methodist, and the prison chaplain was allowed to accompany him to the death chamber. he was essentially strapped in. The 23rd Psalm from "The Lord's my shepherd" was said, and he actually helped them to strap him down. His final words were asking forgiveness for his sins and to give his regards to all of the people at the prison who he thought had been helpful and kind to him, which included the other prisoners, the matron who worked there and took care of a lot of those day-to-day concerns, the warden, and his family. And he was dead within 2 minutes by the shocks of electricity. His remains actually were a bit of a surprise. I just found this out recently because it said in the newspapers that he was going to be buried in Simonsville, that his mother wanted his remains to be there. And apparently from Jonathan Stevens at the Andover Historical Society shared with me some oral histories that share that the surviving family of the Wiggins did not want George Warner buried where their family was, which is a small Simonsville cemetery. So instead, there was sort of some quick, hasty arrangements, and he was buried instead next to his first wife, which was Grace Booley, and their son, who had died. Both of them had died of pneumonia. And that's the end of that piece of the story. And so you can kind of consider all of these as I went along with the story. As you find pieces that you can't necessarily impart when you're talking about murder, but there were a lot of pieces that surprised me. There were people who had divorces. You're dealing with some suicides. You're dealing with individuals who were veterans. So these relationships came up with newspapers research, but my steps for next is how you can research a historic true crime. And I do urge you to consider that the state archives and your local historical societies, the Vermont Historical Society, local places can be really good sources for this information. So a lot of this is in the state archives, but there's also many suggestions for partners and other information. The first thing you need to do is to identify a case. And so in this case, I saw a Valley News article in August 2017 where they talked about how the Vermont Historical Society still has the electric chair in its collections, and that there's also concerns about not wanting bloodthirsty attitudes or people to be too attached to macabre items. But I was intrigued because we had recently acquired court records related to this part of the state in Windsor, and we turned out we had the transcripts. So that was the first key point for me. But you can identify a case in so many different ways. You might find it in a newspaper. I've had people who it turns out that their relative might have been involved in a case, either as a victim, perpetrator, or witness. You can also consider oral histories, published histories. However it is you identify a case, that is the very first step. And for doing this research, I urge people to identify their notes and keep track, because I had a lot of winding roads to get to where I was. So the next thing I like to consider, and in this case for me, is just sit down and consider what kinds of records could exist and what you'd really like to have. So that can include the obvious, like the judiciary records, but I was thinking, oh yes, we have correction records, which include inmate records. We have records that are related to causes that were death and first-degree murder. The newspapers are always great for this kind of research, but then also executive records. Agency reports are stunning, and that includes municipal reports. Municipal reports are an extremely underused item, and there are many different kind of local records. Genealogy, your basic genealogy can be really good for this kind of research. And then there's also some surprising adjacent records. So if you have an idea outlined of where you might want to start, anybody who's done this kind of research probably knows that you end up going down rabbit holes that surprise you. And I definitely had that happen, even though this was sort of a second piece. So I recommend once you've kind of figured out what you want to look at, start by using the research guide or catalog in whatever institution you're looking at. So if you're at the Historical Society, you'll use their catalog, UVM's catalog, any other institution, and be aware it's not like a Google search. So for us, the State Archives, it's by agency who heard the record or had the record. So if you're having trouble identifying where a record might be, contact your archivist or your librarian, because we are happy to help point you in the right direction. And I do consider that part of the fun as well of finding good stories. So the research guide in these cases, I was looking not for a specific keyword name like George Warner, but the court that heard it. So the Windsor County Court, the Supreme Court from Windsor County, the state hospital, the inmate records, the correction records. That's what I was looking for. And then I needed to use the date range to narrow down what containers could have things. Sometimes the containers do have indexes that include names or case numbers or dates, but it's not always as clear cut. So that's why an archivist or reference librarian is so good to help guide you through some of these steps. And I've already assisted several people with that, and I'm excited to do more. So the next step here for a major crime, whether it's murder, burglary, the ones where we're going to have more documentations, is to research the court or courts that heard the case. And what I like to do, this is a little trick, is instead of just going straight to the court cases, I pull the reports of the Attorney General, which we have in the state archives, and are actually published and pretty widely available, some even online. And that gives me a summary of the case right away. It lets me know right here when he was indicted, who he was indicted for, he was charged with murdering, when the trial was, what the court was, that it moved to the Supreme Court, and that it was part of a February term, and that he was indicted. At this point in 1916, it was still pending, but then if you read the following year's journal and report, you can find more information. So these little biannual reports and agency reports of other agencies that would have heard a case can be extremely helpful to give you a summary instead of having to dive right into the rest of the court cases. And the reason for that is that court cases can be a little cumbersome, but they're extremely rich. We have many court cases in the state archives. Also, the Historical Society has some really fantastic supplementary records that can help, sometimes the attorney's records. In this case, for a court docket is basically a court calendar and summary. And the records really depend. Each court kept their own records their own way, and they can be a little confusing. Until the late 1800s, each new term had a new docket number. So you might have to find, if there's continuances, that there may be multiple numbers you're trying to keep track of. But dockets are basically a good way of doing some digging. If you're not quite sure when a case happened or if a case was settled, you can look at the dockets and get a good summary. These are also great for identifying maybe ancestors' involvements in court cases. So this is what some dockets look like, the county court and the Supreme Court. You can see that each of them has a different number. The county court had 5088 for the case, and then also 5089 for the murder of Georgina. Then you can see that the Supreme Court case lists the name of the case, so State v. George Warner, and you'll want that information. And it has the state's attorney as Attorney Cole, and it has George Warner's attorney as Bicknell. It gives a very brief description of what has happened so far in the case. And that's just helpful for anybody, because you might know, okay, if this was continued, I might need to look at a further docket for further information. The next step when it comes to this researching court records is the recording books. The recording books really just summarize the judgment, and they can be really interesting. They usually follow kind of a fill in the blank by this point, where you can see here you add the date of the occurrence, you add where it happened, the town, and you add when it happened, and then you add the charge. So there's opportunities. Murder wasn't a common occurrence in many parts of the state. So you sometimes have instances where there's some additional information that can be really helpful. They're often arranged chronologically by term. And then where you're going to find some of the best, richest information is case files. The case files have this whole laundry list of items, from the plaintiffs and defendants' answers to final actions and even warrants, assessments, dispositions, and appeals. Some case files are extensive, many are not. What survives depends from case to case. But when you do have case files, you also have to consider a few things. I was surprised because we'd received the case files from this court, and it turned out that all of the county court case files were combined with the Supreme Court. So there was nothing with the county court, but I found an abundance of material with the Supreme Court. And that included the charge, which you're seeing here, and it also included the warrant. So sometimes when I try to advise people to consider a few things. If you're looking at something that one of your ancestors or was a victim of, you might want to give yourself a moment. Sometimes people are surprised at how overcome with emotion you feel when you see these kinds of things. So it's just good to give yourself a moment and consider what that might have for you. These documents, again, follow a pretty set pattern, but I still think that these are just a sample of the case files we have for this case. There are many others, and people can view them. There's other kinds of records in with the courts that can be somewhat surprising, and why they might be important is a little unusual. The most exciting in this case was a transcript. There was a 765-page transcript of the entire trial, and it included the final, his confession. That probably was the seal of why the story was so interesting and why it was so well documented. But there's all sorts of other things that can sometimes show up. Most of the time, exhibits, which would include photographs and diagrams and items like the shotgun, those were not maintained. They were either returned to the owners if it was something like that was evidence of a trial for theft, or they were destroyed. But in some instances, we do have photographs and we do have diagrams because for some reason they were not destroyed. So even if a lot of these other records don't exist anymore, sometimes they do. And when they do, they can really fill in a lot on what's going on in this time frame. I cannot stress how helpful searching newspapers are. You see these kinds of headlines, but you can track Vermont titles for free if you're a Vermonter through newspapers.com, and there's some access. And if you're having trouble, you can email us and we'll give you steps on how to access that. But nearly all papers in public domain are available online for people to research. And it's astonishing the kinds of things people find, from accidents to court cases to just day-to-day social attitudes. And just sometimes they'll be like, Mr. and Mrs. Wiggins visited their sons in Boston this week. Those can be helpful too, because it tracks their interaction with their families. Newspapers.com has many of the papers in public domain, and the ones that aren't in public domain are available in our reference room up to about 2017, 18 in many cases. Feel free to contact the reference room if you're having trouble, but what has been so rich since this digitization partnership with newspapers.com is before you'd have to go microfilm by microfilm to find things. Now you can keyword search the victim or the perpetrator and get all of the headings. So George Warner, and that gave me a lot of information and a lot of articles to pick from when doing this kind of research. The next step for this kind of research is, well, we've noted what we have or what we want to look for, but what is missing? So in my case, I had to note that there was the Supreme Court case files were with the county court case files, that George Warner was only tried really for the initial murder of Henry Wiggins. And so they focused on Henry Wiggins, and that exhibits don't usually survive. But there's other things that you might be surprised are missing, and it's good to keep note of that. And then also at the same time, you want to keep track of the identification numbers of all of these various numbers. So all of these numbers you see here were used in different ways to reference a case or George Warner's inmate or case files. That's a lot of different numbers and a lot of different years. And it's important to keep track of what records you were looking at and what identification numbers you need, because you don't want to mix them up or you might find yourself in sort of a confused state. If you have a correction record, check correction records. You can see those kinds of cases. They are limited by law, but usually we can assist you with what is available. George Warner's been deceased well over 100 years, so these records are available for people researching them. There's other kind of correction records. We have description books. After 1914, so just after George was in prison, they were doing the mugshots. So unfortunately, we don't have photos of a lot of these individuals, which doesn't let us have a chance to see what they look like. But these summary cards and summary registers give at least a feel for a person. They give some genealogy information. They give some description information, age, number. So those can be helpful for researchers as well. If there was an appeal in a criminal case, the Supreme Court briefs are more than just the Supreme Court summaries. These are the cases. Sometimes there's friend of the court amicus briefs, but you can see the case as it was made to the Supreme Court by both parties often. And these are really useful for identifying just the information that you might want, especially if you're a legal researcher. These can be extremely helpful. The simpler version is going to be the Vermont reports. Those are widely published and widely available. I recommend people start with those. If you identify a Vermont report, there's very likely going to be a Supreme Court brief case involved. And we certainly can help facilitate that through the reference room. If there was an attempt for pardon or there was an attempt for a reprieve, the next step is to consider officer reports. I'd mentioned officer reports earlier, but this one was helpful because I had the actual description. The governor had contacted the attorney general, so Percival Clement, asking if he could reprieve George Warner for and return and make it a clemency, so he would be only imprisoned for life. But the Attorney General, F.C. Archibald, said that he didn't think the Constitution allowed it at the time. Other people might have made further differences, and it would certainly interest me if people came and did more extensive research on executions in the state. So furthermore, if there were attempts to reprieve, we have executive records. And the ones that are part of the Governor Percival Clements are just survive on microfilm. But there is about a 25-page case file of petitions, as well as some of the affidavits and other attempts to free him, or at least make it so that George Warner was just tried and left to live in prison for the rest of his life. None of that was successful, but the documents are really interesting. And then the other things to consider are there's other supporting records that may be related to a case that people don't think about. We have municipal reports in the state archives, and they start in the 1840s, and they're more extensive in the 1890s. And it includes the labor for the digging of the graves from the cemetery trustees report of the victims. It also includes other kinds of information depending on the report you're looking for. And it's very surprising to me how much is in these municipal reports and how underused they are. I've already mentioned the death warrant, but if a person was executed because of their crime, the death warrants are interesting pieces of that. Again, if anybody would like copies of these documents, you can email me and we can get them to you. And all the same thing with the slides because they're public record. The other thing to consider is affiliated cases. So in this case, this is the murder. The murderer was eventually divorced, but Etta Warner had started the proceedings just before the murder occurred, and it actually was entered after the murder happened. So it was granted in 1917, mostly because the rest of the court case had to happen first and was taking up the time. But these kinds of affiliated course documents can be extremely helpful for timeline purposes. And then don't forget the other repositories and other sources. This, what you're looking at, was actually found on FamilySearch.org, and it's the burial permit. If a body was removed, like from the Windsor prison to Simonsville, or as it finally ended up happening in Weston, they needed a burial certificate. And so this has the information, including a medical attendant and who took the body. And even though you can see on the document, it said that the proposed burial was Simonsville, the verso of the certificate notes that it actually happened in Weston, which was new to me. I did not know this in the 1918, when I wrote this in 2018. And then the census records can also be extremely helpful, and those are available through Family Search accounts at no charge or online for many other sources. This showed just how close the families lived to each other. You can see George Warner in 1910 with his family, Etta, and then you can see just down the road, the Wiggins. And then as a bonus, you can also find the laws, legislations. So this was just an opportunity to see when the death penalty had changed from hanging to electric chair. And that document is in our holdings as well. So my last tips for doing this kind of research is keep track of all those case files and the numbers, keep notes or a research log. Try to follow the story as it unfolds and not to jump to conclusions. That's good advice because I think everybody kind of does sometimes. Local records and genealogy research is imperative. And do note records that aren't there and move on. I got a little too fixated sometimes. I'm going to admit that. Try not to. And then please contact your reference archivists or librarians for help if you need it. We are here to help. My conclusion is that researching a tragedy can sometimes feel like a puzzle. It can feel like you're only getting part of the picture because there's pieces that are missing and you won't have them. You won't have the photo that I wanted or a map that I wanted. It's also part of seeing these through what's covered up, because these people have descendants who still live in Vermont. They might still feel very connected. You have to remember that there's individuals who are victims, there are individuals who are perpetrators, there were items and events that were happening in Vermont. And even though it was a long time ago for us, it happened to them, and it meant their lives were forever changed, and the lives of their descendants in many ways has changed. And so when you're uncovering those pieces, you can see them only wholly or partly, but this is Vermont stories, and a true crime Vermont isn't just about what happened a long time ago, because these are still things that happen now. There's still murder, there's still impoverished people, there's still some people who are from good families and so-called bad families, And it's far more complicated than just a simple true crime. It is an intrigue, though. It is a fascinating research, and I really encourage you to come visit your local archive historical society and find the story that is there for you. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really intriguing, and I love getting a chance to see some of these amazing documents. So we do have a couple of questions to start, but again, if you have any other questions, we have a few minutes. Feel free to pop them in the Q&A or any comments in the chat. And our first question, and I think this is a fun one as it relates to sort of talking about genealogy as part of your research. Do you know any relation to the Wiggins Tavern in Northampton, Massachusetts?
I don't know offhand, but I believe there is, because the family, there were Wiggins who lived in that area. So it would take a little bit more research, but I believe there probably is a connection. There were Wiggins living in Boston area, in Massachusetts, and then also in New Hampshire. So come on and send me that, and we can do some more digging.
So the other question right now that we have open is they have explored newspapers.com with back issues for the Montpelier paper. And while it was helpful, they found that some of the scans are too blurred to be legible. Are there other copies available of these newspapers and other resources?
We do have microfilm copies of them, and it's possible that there were some versions that were done hastily. So if you're having trouble, feel free to send a citation to that email there, and we can certainly rescan or make some attempts. There's some options with some of the software we have that makes them a little clearer as well.
Awesome. Another message from Lisa. I always thought that county records were turned over to the state on a regular interval, but it sounds like you're still finding things over 100 years later. Is that true?
County court records have only started coming to us with recent acquisitions. So sometimes it surprises me what the court finds. Most of the time we have a blanket agreement with the courts to take in court records up to 1945. And then once in a while we'll be like, somebody will find that they're clearing out something and they find something that got misplaced. So we actually recently acquired some records that are being processed as we speak by my colleagues. So yes, sometimes we've gotten a lot of records due to my excellent work by my colleagues in records management. So they've been acquiring more by partnerships. So yes, there may be some surprises, and it's worth every once in a while just doing a quick check-in and finding out what might else be available.
Yeah, wonderful. I have sort of a brief question. Do you sort of talk about keeping track of things? Do you have any favorite tools or software or other things that you use for keeping track of your research?
To be fully honest, I mostly have my own little archaic little system, but checklists are actually pretty good to do. There's a few out there. Even just setting up like a document, a Word document, or whatever your preferred one is, and just making sure you keep track in some way. That's kind of what I do, is bullet point checklist of this is what I'm looking for and this is what I've seen. I am happy to share some of those little cheat tools with people as well.
Great. And looks like one last question. You mentioned historical records from the Waterbury Hospital. What sorts of records are available and for what years? Presumably more recent records would not be available because of privacy.
Right. We don't have patient records after the 1960s. And what we have from when it comes to patient records are really just patient census, except for the very earliest. We have the earliest decades, like 1888, 1898, we have more extensive records of patients, but after that we do not. But there's a lot of records of the state hospital related to photographs, administrative records, clinical studies, the nursing unit. So there's actually a fair amount of records on the state hospital. Some records are going to be limited due to law for patient records, but we can usually provide a summary for the descendants. So that reach out to the State Archives. There's quite a lot you could see.
Great, and we'll take one more question. We're a little bit over time, but just because I always love good questions. Have you explored cold cases with the possibility of trying to solve them?
So I have not. We do have people who have. We work kind of one of my colleagues works with the cold case investigators at times for some of this, mostly because some of those records might still be in the custody of the courts or in the custody of the various agencies that investigated them. But the last attempt to do so didn't really pan out because the cold case was from the 1920s.
Ooh.
So, but my there are some attempts. So it's just a little harder to do.
Yeah, I think I think again, you talk about sort of all the different places and things to look at. And I think also sort of the idea that we kept records differently, 50 years ago even, or 100 years ago than we do now.
So feel free to email questions to the reference team. I and my colleagues answer that during our regular business hours. And if you do want to come do your own research, you can also call us at that number and make an appointment for some research. Or if you'd like to, we do welcome walk-ins as well.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Mariessa. And again, feel free. They are awesome folks at the State Archives and always happy to help. And thank you everyone for coming. And again, if you're registering, you will get a copy of the recording. Thanks again.